Hey all, Lossien here. The first thing I did was look up a pattern for the 1690s stays. This was what I found. It was a quick sketch that someone had on their website, which was marquise.de. So I will link that below. So what I did is I actually measured all the way across and then measured the drop approximately based on the waist. Then measured each section and figured out how much each section was of the total. So I got a percentage. Then I used my bust measurement and figured out how much each panel should be based on that percentage. I did the same for the waist, and then I did the same for the height. It's a lot of math. Then I cut that out on two sides. I only have one side left though. And when I initially did it on my seam allowances, I actually put boning into each channel so that I could get a fit idea. And it fit very well, and I liked the way it fit. My main issue was that these seam lines do not at all line up with what they do in the film. So I took the other half and while wearing it, drew the lines on. So now I had a new idea of what I wanted to do. So I recut the whole thing again, putting in my boning every single step, and tried that on. Oh, this is upside down. Ha! The only thing I had to do was take in this line just a little bit, and then the whole thing fit the way I wanted it to. So the other side became my pattern pieces, and I made sure to label them all so that I knew in the end which piece went where. And that was how I made my pattern for the bodice. This is the interlining slash lining, because I'm not going to bother putting a lining on top of it because I'm only wearing it as a costume. So I cut out 2 layers of the pattern and sewed them together separately, and then I sewed them together on all the seams, making sure they all matched up. Then I marked off where my grommets are going to go. So there's some at the front where it laces up. There's some here at the corner for the strap. And then this whole section here is where the back lacing is going to go. Then what I did was mark out, well, I didn't mark out, I just sewed all my boning channels. I started at the front and worked my way out, doing just the front one on either side. This is after I sewed all the seams. And then I just went the width of my boning across all the way, flat out. You can see it's really teeny tiny up here. Boning I used just zip ties because you can get them pretty cheap at hardware stores. I got like 500 for 15 bucks I think, and they're super long. Like they were long enough for all of this, even crazy side pieces up here. So then on the second panel, I went in line with this seam here and just continued using the previously stitched line as a pattern for the next line all the way up. So I did a single line here, then space for my grommets, then more lining up here. This next panel in, I lined up with this outer seam and worked my way in. You can see it gets really tiny again on the bottom there. And then on this panel, which was the last one, I lined it up with the back because I tried it on when everything else was done except for this panel to see how it sat on me. And it pretty much was almost entirely even. There was just this one little piece up there. So once that was done, I stitched along the bottom and along the top, just in from the actual finished edge length, so that when I put my fashion fabric on top, it can go up here and we can put everything else on it and still have space. So yeah, that's done. And it's finished from the inside too. There's just a bunch of threads that I have to trim. But yeah, it looks pretty good. The first step to cutting out the fashion fabric, which is the outside fabric that you see, is actually to iron the fabric. It seems pointless and sometimes I skip this step, but with something like this where it's really specific that everything fits perfectly, it's good to take the time. Once it was pressed, it was time to fold it in half again and cut out the pattern pieces. I laid them down on the fabric, making sure that the front piece was perpendicular to the rest of the pieces, because it was imperative that it had a slightly different sheen. Then I pinned them and cut them. I left extra fabric at the top and bottom to fold it over the lining, and along the back as well, just to make things easier. I also left some extra at the grommets at the front, because it's supposed to stay open there. So you need a little extra fabric to deal with that. And also I notched it, which you can't see. After that was done, I marked the bias on the fabric so that there was a little bit of stretch. Went and grabbed the lining to make sure that it actually lined up all the way along the fabric, and I knew that I needed 2 complete cuts to cover the top and the bottom in a bias. It ended up being like a piping situation, but it was the right amount of fabric. So I pinned it and cut it out. Once the fabric was cut, the next step was to lay it all out, good side up, in order so I could see what was going on and grab all my reference pictures. Then I started drawing on each panel all the different embroidery, where the lines were, where the circles were. As best I could tell, they had multiple versions, so every image changed slightly. I just took the ones that looked the most right to me and went with that. With this piece of scrap fabric on top of a piece of tearaway backing, I did a quick embroidery sample just to make sure that what I thought was going to work was actually going to look the way I wanted it to, before I committed to the whole thing. After that, each piece was put onto some tearaway backing, and then I did all of the machine embroidery. All of it. It was a lot. Then it was time for the very satisfying part of tearing the terrible backing off. I left where the circles were, as that was where the beading was going to be, but yeah, it was satisfying just ripping it off. Now the center of each circle needed beading. Each color circle was a different color beading, and it took a while to do all of the beading. I'm just going to show you one. There were a lot of circles. This is also sped up, just to give a good idea of how long I spent doing this. I mean, I listened to some good stuff while I was doing it. Podcasts are my jam. What's a podcast you recommend? Yeah, beading is time consuming. Yep. And then I still had a bunch more to do after this. Now it was time for the fun part, sewing every piece together. Since I kept all the pieces in order, all I did was start at one end and sew seam by seam all the way to the other end, making sure to line up all of the notches and just go through piece by piece by piece. I also kept the lining on hand just to double check that everything was lining up correctly, and that if I needed to take it in or let out each seam a little bit, I could do it right away. And after sewing, it's time to press open all of the seams. We were so close to the end of this. The next step was to line up the fashion outer shell to the inner shell, the lining, and make sure that every single seam lined up exactly. If you have to re-sew something, now is the time to do it, otherwise it can screw the whole thing up. Once it was completely pinned, the next step was to pin on the piping. I used a rat tail, which I also ended up using as the lacing up the back, put it in that bias tape we had, started at the center front, and worked my way towards the side. I left all the seam allowance pointing up so that eventually it could fold under and be stitched down nicely on the inside. Once one side was done, I started at the center again and went to the other side all along the top. The rat tail was quite slippery, so there was some frustration, but managed to get it done. I also went along the bottom because she has piping on both the top and the bottom just to complete the whole look. I changed my foot on my machine to a zipper foot, which allows you to sew closer to an edge, and then I stitched the piping down along the bottom, making sure to take out the pins before I sewed over them, because you can break a lot of needles that way. And once that was done, I switched to the top and sewed along the top edge. Pretty straightforward. It's just being careful of the pins and making sure everything's stitching as close to that edge as possible without going over that rat tail or cording or whatever else you have to give it the volume. Then I flipped to the wrong side, the lining side of the garment, and took all that extra seam allowance on the piping and double folded it so there were no raw edges and pinned it all the way around. Then I got hand sewn down so that we had no raw edges, nothing to fray, and it looked nice and pretty from the inside. This is also the time I took to sew down the fashion fabric from the front along where the grommets were, making sure that it was nice and wide and would cover past the grommets on both sides. We had pinned it much earlier on, but now was the time to actually stitch it down. And the final step on the bodice was the grommets. I ended up using a bunch of different tools. The very first thing I did was mark where all the grommet placement was going to be with a ruler and chalk, just to make sure it was completely symmetrical. We had put way too much into this at this point to try anything else. Then I used both a hole punch and an awl to try and spread the fabric wide enough without damaging it too much, and things got a little hairy. I ended up giving it to my husband to put all the grommets and eyelets in. There's no video footage of that one. So in the end, I think it's pretty accurate. I'm missing the little bag because I ran out of time because I ended up getting sick, and I didn't get the cape done because I didn't buy enough material for the skirt and the hood of the cape. So in future, I want to make the cape because I still have the material for it, and the little pouch, but with more time. I ended up cutting this a little too short because I didn't double check my references when I was making the skirt, so at some point I may replace that panel with a new one. And this, in theory, should have been straight across here and only bunched at the sides, but that's relatively easy to fix. I ended up not being able to find a good lace that I liked. This was a shirt I got from a secondhand store, so a little wonk on one side, but overall, I'm really happy with it. I don't plan on remaking the large parts of it. I plan on just fixing the front panel, adding the pouch, and adding the cape, and then I think it's good to wear another year. But yeah. Overall, I'm pretty happy. It ended up taking about a week to make, start to finish. Let me know in the comments below what you think. If you think I should have spent more time on one thing and less on the other. The corset ended up being the big thing with all the details. And happy Halloween!